Hey there folks, welcome to the Photo Video Show where we explore all things DSLR. I'm your host, Mark Puckett. So continuing on with the Photography Fundamentals series, this is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, go back. And if you've already watched this episode, go forward. At any rate, today we're going to be discussing aperture, shutter speed, and ISO as an overview. So, like I said, Photography Fundamentals, this is part 2. Let's get started. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are essentially what creates your images. And you need to know how each one works and interacts with each other so that you can create beautiful pictures. Now, I'm going to have a sheet made available. You can find the link down below, and you should be able to download this and use this as a cheat sheet. And we'll be referencing this throughout this episode, so grab it now, pause the video, grab it now, and we'll get started. So, why do we need so many settings in the first place? I mean, there are a ton of different things that you can change, alter, and enhance and dehance and all this. There's a million things you can do to alter your photograph, and we need to know what they all do in order to master them. But we need a lot of settings so that we can be more creative and have more control over what our pictures look like. So I'm going to start off with exposure and what it actually means. I'm going to read down here at the bottom, and it says, using your camera's inbuilt light meter enables you to get the correct exposure. If you keep the dial in the middle, the photo will be correctly exposed. If not, you will need to adjust one of the settings below. So when you have your camera up to your eye and you're getting ready to shoot a shot, if you're on a Nikon, look here to the left, if the little dial is in the center on 0, it is a perfectly exposed picture according to the built-in light meter. Now, if it starts to veer off to the left, it will be overexposed, which means it will be very hot or bright in certain areas. And then if the meter begins to go a little bit to the right, that means it will be underexposed, meaning that you will have no detail in the shadows. It will start to get really dark. Okay, and if you have a Canon, it will be pretty much the same, only opposite on the overexposure and underexposure. So if you're in the middle, you're good. If you're to the right, it's going to be too bright. If you're on the left-hand side, you'll be negative, which means you'll be underexposed. So that kind of brings us to the exposure triangle. I've introduced this concept to many of my students, including in a video I did probably about 3 years ago. But the exposure triangle is just an example of what we need in order to expose correctly. ISO controls the amount of noise that is either not in our picture, or as we go higher in ISO, we'll introduce more noise into that picture. Noise means digital grain too. It's kind of a gross artifact of the digital photography world. But we'll get into that more later. Aperture controls depth of field, whether things are blurry at this distance or this distance, whether the blurriness starts really close or if it starts really far away. And shutter speed controls motion blur. Don't get the blur from shutter speed mixed in with the depth of field. Blurriness is not necessarily the same as bokeh. And again, I'll have to explain it to you further as we move along, but if something is moving, it will streak and smear, whereas aperture, the depth of field, is very soft and just creamy, blurry. It's a huge difference, but I'll give you examples to help you understand better. So, with the exposure triangle as your guide, you're going to be able to see that if you move one or you alter your f-stop, you may have to alter your ISO or your shutter speed in order to get the perfect exposure. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to create this perfect exposure triangle so that everything is nice and balancing everyone, each other out, and everything just works. But again, I'll give you more examples as we go forward. So let's start off with aperture though, because it's the most simple for most people to comprehend, and it is also the easiest to give examples for. So aperture controls your depth of field, and it also determines how much light gets into the camera or how little light gets into the camera. So let me read down here at the bottom real quick. The pupil in your eye operates in a very similar manner or way to the aperture in your camera. The lower the light levels, the larger your pupil will become to allow more light in to enter your eyeball. In such conditions, you need a larger hole in your lens to let more light into the camera. In bright light, your pupils are smaller, so less light can enter the eye. In these conditions, you need a smaller hole in your lens. So if you apply it to your pupil in your eyeball, it makes perfect sense. You need a bigger hole in order to allow more light in low light conditions. You need a smaller hole to let less light in really bright conditions like sunshine, direct light, all that kind of stuff. But like I said, it also creates depth of field. The bigger your hole in the lens is, the shallower the depth of field, so a lot less things are going to be in focus. So a lot of wedding photographers use extremely low f-stops to get that really soft and dreamy feel, you know, weddings and the little babies and the whole thing. Everything's very soft and romantic. And then when you want everything to just be tack sharp, just perfectly in focus, you use a higher f-stop. And a lot of landscape photographers use higher f-stops because A, they have to shoot at, you know, in broad daylight. And B, because they want everything in the scene. They want these beautiful, huge vistas to be perfectly in focus. So, and aperture works a lot like the blinds on a window. If you have it stopped down to like an f/22, it's only going to let a little bit of light in. But if it's really bright outside, you don't need to let a whole lot of light in. You're going to see just fine. Now, if you get down to around the f/8 range, it's sort of like opening the blinds up about halfway because it's, you know, it's getting a little bit darker, so you want to allow more light to come in and better expose for your photograph. And having your camera just wide open, like an f/1.4 or an f/1.2, if you happen to have that kind of money, that's what this looks like. You're letting as much light in as possible because you can't see very well. So you're just trying to let everything in as much as you humanly possibly can. And here are examples of what the blades on your lens will look like through the various stages of f-stoppage. So f/1.8, the lens is just going to be wide open. f/2.8, a little bit smaller, 4.0, 5.6, you get the idea. So smaller the number, bigger the hole, bigger the number, smaller the hole. And up here, if it's in 1.8, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. And down here at f/22, you're going to have a very wide depth of field. So now let's move on to the shutter speed. I'm going to go ahead and start off by reading this here at the bottom. It says the speed at which you blink your eyes has a similar effect to the shutter speed in your camera. If you open your eyes for a short amount of time, only a small amount of light will enter. So a high shutter speed has that same effect. If you keep your eyes open for a longer amount of time, more light will enter. So a slow shutter speed has the same effect. So on your camera, if it happens to be a DSLR or some of the more advanced mirrorless cameras, you can go all the way up to 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or hold it open indefinitely if you have it on bulb. And if you go all the way up to say like 5,000 or 4,000, 10,000, whatever your shutter speed will go up to, that is going to give you less light into the camera, and it is mainly used for extremely bright situations. So this is a good guide right here. If you're going to use a slow shutter speed, you can use those slower shutter speeds for a sleeping baby, maybe a spinning carousel, a building at night. You use moderate shutter speeds for a child or animal that's just chilling, not doing anything, maybe 160 or so for a moving child, and about 500 to 1,000 for like action activities, sports, stuff like that. Now you're going to want to use a really fast shutter speed for moving cars, sports photography, or a hummingbird on a flower. So just remember that the smaller the number on your shutter speed, you're going to introduce more motion blur into your photograph. The higher the number, you're going to freeze more action and have less motion blur. And this is an example. Here on the left, we have this pinwheel. It is just completely stopped. It is frozen. So we're looking at a high shutter speed. In the middle, we're looking at a moderate shutter speed, and it's begin to blur. It's starting to kind of blend into itself, but not quite yet. And then we have a really slow shutter speed where the whole thing is just clearly blending and blurring into itself. And that is what shutter speed does. It controls the motion, the blurriness of motion. This is another example. So we've got running water. If we use a high shutter speed, we'll freeze the water midair. If we use a slow shutter speed, the water will blend into itself and it'll look very soft and dreamy. This is actually a night shot where someone actually wanted to capture the blurriness, because it does look very beautiful, wanted to capture the blurriness of moving objects. So we're at nighttime, it's a very low light scene, you're opening your shutter speed up for extended period of time, probably 30 seconds to a minute, maybe even longer, and it's just capturing the streak in headlights and tail lights as the cars come up and down the hill. So these are always very cool, everyone usually likes them. This is another example. Drop something in some water, it splashes up, you hit the flash and the shutter speed's really high, it'll freeze all the water droplets in midair. Very cool stuff. And of course these are always popular as well. This wonderful waterfall, nothing's really moving in this scene except for the water, so you slow that shutter speed down, allow the water to flow down the rocks, and it turns into something beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. So the last thing I want to discuss on this episode is ISO. And ISO effectively is the sensitivity to light. So let me read down here at the bottom. The sensor in your camera is like a pair of sunglasses. The darker the sunglasses, the less sensitive your lights or your eyes are to the light, which is the same as having the camera set at ISO 100. So if you put on clear spectacles, your eyes are more sensitive to light, which is the same as having your camera set to, say, ISO 1600 plus. So let me give you my rule of thumb, and I'm coming at you for real here. I never use ISO, I never adjust ISO unless I absolutely cannot get the shot that I want, altering aperture and shutter speed. Why? Because the more you increase ISO, it will be a brighter image. You may be able to get a better shot, but you'll have more noise in that photograph. A lower ISO means less noise, a higher ISO means more noise. That's not to say that it can't be dealt with, say like in post, but if you don't have to do all that extra work, why would you? And this here is exactly what I've been talking about. The grossness, the disgustingness. The picture here on the left is of the building with very low artifacting, so we're looking at a low ISO image here. And on the right hand side, we've got the ISO just cranked all the way up. And you can see that the ISO, the blurriness, the blockiness, the graininess, all disgusting. No one wants to see that. So don't try and peddle this as awesome, because it's not. So don't mess with your ISO if you can absolutely help it. So that's the end of Aperture ISO and shutter speed as an overview. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. If you would, please like and subscribe to the channel for more updates and videos on the topic. And I hope to see you guys again on the next episode right here on the Photo Video Show. I'm your host, Mark Puckett. We'll see you guys again next time.